Welcome once again to the Tin Dog Podcast. This week there's going to be 2 Tin Dog podcasts released. This one will be the first. This is the review of the Time Meddler. The second one will be released tomorrow, and that will be a review of this week's episode of Torchwood, because I am aware that some of you are actively avoiding the Torchwood reviews until you've seen the episode, which is perfectly acceptable, and you don't want to miss out on something like a review, so I thought it was easier to release 2 shows than to release 1. Obviously, I'll put a warning on that podcast to come back and get this one if you want to listen to this one. Many people, of course, just download them all, in which case I'm sorry I've bored you. The DVD of the Time Meddler is coming out in the next few days, and I thought I would review it just so that you've got an idea of what you're letting yourself in for if you buy it. It's a William Hartnell story. It's in black and white. It's almost definitively old school. It was, I think, the first William Hartnell story that I ever saw, obviously not including The Unearthly Child, and I must admit I was very impressed. I was surprised in 1993 when I first saw it that Peter Purves was actually in it. This is a guy I'd only known from Blue Peter as I was growing up, and even then only vaguely, or perhaps from presenting Crufts, but here was a well-rounded, well-thought-out and well-written character, and this story has stood the test of time. As well as Peter Purves playing the character Stephen, a futuristic adventurer who in the previous story had been caught by the mechanoids and released during that storyline, we are then presented with the character of Vicki. Now, Vicki, for many people, is just a replacement Susan, but obviously she's definitely not from Gallifrey, and the debates over whether Susan is really the Doctor's granddaughter can stay for another day. Here we're talking Vicki. Again, she's generic up to a certain extent, but in this story she definitely fulfills the role. If this story was made today, it would of course be 45 minutes long, and there is enough plot to fill 45 minutes. This was so obvious that episode 2 doesn't actually have William Hartnell in it at all. It has a videotaped cutaway because William was on holiday that week. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just true. The highlight of this story, performance-wise though, is Peter Butterworth, a man known for most English people as the bloke out of the Carry On films, who actually wrote many of the Carry On films as well. He plays someone from the unnamed home planet of the Doctor, or indeed the Doctor's time, because obviously in the very early Doctor Who stories, it was implied that the Doctor was in fact from the future, rather than from another planet. The meddling monk, who is the character that we'll call here, isn't actually called that. He is referred to as a Time Meddler, is from the same place as the Doctor. He's turned up on the Northumbrian coast, and this is what would become later known as a pseudo-historical. It's a Doctor Who story set in historical time, but has alien intervention of some kind involved in the plot. Peter Butterworth's character, the Time Meddler, is dressed as a monk. He's arrived in Northumbria. His plan in 1066 is to wipe out the invading Viking fleet, and thus allowing King Harold to defend the south coast against the Norman invasion without worrying that he's... Oh, if you know history, you understand this sort of thing. Basically, the King of England went to Northumbria to fend off some Vikings, and then ran all the way to the south coast of England and had to fend off the Norman invasion. His men were exhausted and he couldn't fight them off, so that was the problem there. The monk's going to change that. He's got a long-term plan. Rather comically, his plan seems to be written out on a roller blind that he can carry around with him and tick things off as he does them. A nice touch. As with most DVDs, there's a lot of extras in this story. You get a very short documentary called Stripped for Action, which is all about the First Doctor's appearances in comics throughout English history. At the time, sort of 1966-ish. and the way that it evolved. It's an interesting documentary if you're interested in that sort of thing, although how it affects this story I'm not completely sure. This is one of the last recordings that I'm aware of where Verity Lambert was actually there for one of the commentaries. So if you want to know more about Lambert's input to the show, listening to the commentaries in these DVDs is a definite must. Purvis again also is on the commentary, as well as several other important behind the scenes people. The whole disc is dedicated to Verity Lambert's memory, which is as it should be. And of course this also contains Verity Lambert's obituary and some photographs. As a side note, I just want to say that when I was growing up there was a Doctor Who role-playing game, and I used it as a source book for many of the facts. I use facts in a kind of putting little rabbit ears around things kind of a way. One of the so-called facts that was in this book was the meddling monk was an early regeneration of the Master. It just doesn't fit. It's just blatantly not true and not the case. But a lot of people thought that, especially in the early 80s, because he was a Time Lord, he was messing with history. The meddling monk was a meddler. He does appear later on in another story, but that's lost. He also has a TARDIS, very similar to the Doctor's. In fact, they used the same set, they just painted the floor black. And he refers to it as a Mark IV TARDIS, which is 50 years later in the production line. Now, as the old school fans know, the Doctor's TARDIS is a Type 40 TARDIS. Whether it's currently the same TARDIS he's always had, we just don't know, and that is debatable, depending on which books you choose to believe, or whether it actually matters. So, a Type 40 TT capsule is not a Mark III or a Mark IV. So, the best way of bringing these two things together is A, ignore it because it doesn't really matter, or B, because such things do matter to people like us, is to imagine that Type 40 is the large brand name type, and the Mark III and the Mark IV are subtypes of the Type 40. Makes perfect sense, doesn't have to annoy anyone, perfectly acceptable. And you know, if this is all I can find to complain about this story, it's a good story. And it is. I'll leave you now, and I'll get on with reviewing Torchwood. Be seeing you. You have been listening to the Tin Dog Podcast. Doctor Who and its associated shows are all trademark of the BBC. No infringement is intended. Contact us at tin-dog@hotmail.co.uk.